Now, after we finish the study on these, what's known as the church fathers, so to speak, we will move on to talking about the fragments of the New Testament that make up the different versions of the American Standard and the New King or the King James, and then the New American Standard and the New King James. So we will talk about those after we finish talking about this, and then after the fragments, we'll start talking about the appearances of the different denominations, starting around 250 AD with the Catholic Church. Okay, here we are. All right. So last time we had our church history class, we talked about Polycarp, and this is an individual who, again, most of these individuals, we don't have a lot of their writings remaining. In fact, the majority of what we know about some of these people comes from people who wrote 100 years after the fact. And some of these definitely seem to have had a certain agenda when they wrote what they wrote. Irenaeus, we already talked about him, some of the records that he wrote detailing people like Polycarp. He had already a misunderstanding of Scripture. We talked a little bit about that last week, or last class, in his thought process of the 1,000-year reign, premillennialist. And then we talked about Eusebius. Eusebius comes up frequently in discussions of New Testament scholarship and so forth. Eusebius didn't come on the scene until about 300 AD. And so the stuff that he writes quoting people, where he got that information from, whether he just made it up, which may not be outside the realm of possibility in some cases based on things that he says people said, or he heard it from so-and-so who heard it from their grandfather who heard it from so-and-so. It's just one of those things that it's dubious in its, oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Dubious in its account. So, last thing we talked about was number 11. Irenaeus, who as a young man had claimed he heard Polycarp preach, said of him, a man who was of much greater weight and more steadfast witness of truth than Valentinus and Marcion and the rest of the heretics. Polycarp had learned from Apostle John to flee from those who changed the divine truth. One day he met in the streets of Rome the heretic Marcion, who, resenting that Polycarp did not greet him, said, "Do you know me?" And Polycarp replied, "Yes, I know you, the firstborn of Satan." And as we ended, let's see, this was Sunday, June 30th was our last history class because we flipped classes. We ended talking about the fact that John, Paul, Peter, all of them warned about specifically false teachers and not to keep company with such individuals. And supposedly Marcion is one of those who was either Gnostic or wrote things that were Gnostic-like, and he also may have believed in premillennialism as well. So certainly not according to what the truth held, and so Polycarp's response is understandable. Number 12, Polycarp lived in an age after the deaths of the apostles when a variety of interpretations of the sayings of Jesus were being preached. This is not new, okay? This was going on even after Jesus died and into the early goings of the church around 50 and 60 AD. We knew stuff like this was happening. I mean, Paul wrote to the Corinthians about it, these super apostles who were twisting words, the Galatians, who among them were being taught to combine the old law with aspects of Christianity and kind of have this hybrid version of the gospel, which wasn't another gospel at all, Paul says. So we know this is already happening. His role, and of course Polycarp is living, of course most of his writings are dated to around 100 to 120 AD, so this is about 60 years after Paul had died. His role was to authenticate Orthodox teachings through his reputed connection with the Apostle John, which is to say a lot of the writings claimed to be by apostles or claimed to be by people who were Christians or claimed to be teachers. He would read these and determine if they matched up with what the apostle, specifically John, said, or at least this is what it's claiming that he did. A high value was attached to the witness Polycarp could give as to the genuine tradition of old apostolic doctrine, the teaching of the apostles, which the teaching of the apostles came from Jesus. Okay, that's where it came from. Weiss, he's a New Testament scholar, commented, his testimony condemning as offensive novelties the figments of the heretical teachers. Irenaeus states that on Polycarp's visit to Rome, his testimony converted many disciples of Marcion and Valentinus. So it sounds like he kind of was, again, if this is accurate, and if Irenaeus is accurately recording this, it certainly sounds like Polycarp was active in working against what the false teachers were trying to teach about Christ. Anything through number 12? All right. Number 1 of B. So we're now going to talk about Polycarp's writings a little bit. Again, most of his writings are gone. The sole surviving work attributed to him is Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, a mosaic of references to the Greek scriptures. Again, something that seems to be a theme when it comes to men like this and these other individuals we've talked about. Again, they're called the church fathers. These are the men who kind of were kind of the primary individuals after the death of the apostles and the first generation disciples, so to speak. The one thing that we see in all the letters that are generally considered authentic is continual quotes from writers of the New Testament. In the letters that are either widely or at least slightly considered to be false or false attribution, or somebody writing in the name of so-and-so, there is no quoting or not much quoting of New Testament scripture. But the ones that seem to be universally understood to be accurate and attributed to the right people is constantly quoting from scripture. And there's a lot of sense that goes along with that, in that if you were one of the early Christians and you're writing a letter to the Philippians, you're writing a letter here or there or wherever, and you're just wanting to reinforce the scriptures, okay, well, you're just going to quote what the New Testament writer said. That's what you're going to do. If you're not adding anything to it and you're just confirming or emphasizing the truth of the gospel, then really let the gospel speak. It's going to speak for you far better than you can. And so it makes a lot of sense that that some of these writings, it seems like all of them are quoting from the Greek scriptures. It and an account of the martyrdom of Polycarp. Remember, we talked about the martyrdom of Polycarp, which was written by the Smyrnans, whether it was accurate or not, form part of the collection of writings Roman Catholics and some Protestants term the Apostolic Fathers. This title emphasizes the writing's particular closeness to the apostles in church traditions. And closeness, it's not saying that these men took on the role of apostles, although there are some religions that believe that there was apostolic continuation after the death of the apostles, that certain individuals on whom hands were laid by the apostles became apostles after those apostles died. So there are religions that do believe that. But what this is saying is that there is a first generation connection by these individuals to the apostles. Irenaeus was much younger. He didn't have a first generation connection. Eusebius certainly didn't. He was 200 years detached from John the apostle. But men like Polycarp, Papias, and so forth, these are men who were either there with the apostles or they were taught maybe by John in the later first century. So these would have been individuals who, at least according to these sources, have a particular attachment to the apostles, and therefore certain credence was given to the things that they claim to have written or that are claimed to have been written by them. After the Acts of the Apostles, which describes the death of Stephen, the martyrdom is considered one of the earliest genuine accounts of Christian martyrdom, and it's one of the earliest known Christian documents of this kind. After the writings of the New Testament, you have the martyrdom. And again, that was written supposedly by the Smyrnians, detailing individuals who had died for the cause of Christ. A bunch of people in there that we don't know anything about. It's just kind of a list of people who had died because of their faith in Christ. But listed was Polycarp. Now keep in mind that this is the account where Polycarp was supposedly burned at the stake, and then he wouldn't burn, and then so they had to stab him, and his blood put out the flames. So whether it may have been embellished, whether or not, there may be some kernel of truth to how Polycarp died, in being, maybe he was stabbed and then burned at the stake or whatever, but regardless, certainly there may be some truth to that. Anything through number 1. Number 2. The letter to the Philippians, often simply called Philippians, which is confusing because that's what we call the letter of Philippians by Paul, is an epistle composed around AD 110 to 140 by Polycarp of Smyrna, from Antioch to the early Christian church in Philippi. The letter is described by Irenaeus as follows. There is also a forceful epistle written by Polycarp to the Philippians, from which those who wish to do so and are anxious about their salvation can learn the character of his faith and the preaching of the truth. The specifics about this particular letter, as we noted, this sole surviving work is Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and then of course we have the account of him. Then everything else after that is just what about people have said about him. So as of Irenaeus' time, he was familiar with this letter. Number 3, the letter is one of a number believed to have been written by Polycarp, but is the only extant, still in existence, document. The letter, it was composed in Greek, but the Greek text has not been preserved in its entirety. There is also a Latin translation of the letter. Moreover, a few quotations of it are preserved in Syriac. So the whole letter doesn't exist, but portions of it do. And through this letter, it's kind of, I don't want to put it in terms that make it sound bad or anything, but it's kind of more of an encouragement letter, so to speak. Kind of similar to the actual letter of Philippians from Paul. It's a letter confirming faith. It's a letter talking about the need for steadfastness in the face of persecution and so forth. Number 4, this talks about it a little bit. The letter warns against a number of disorders in the church, not necessarily in Philippi, but among the brethren at large, and against apostasy, and encourages the Christians to persevere in good works. It also acted as a covering letter for a collection of writings by Ignatius of Antioch, whose works were being collected by the church of Philippi after Ignatius' visit there. Remember, we talked about Ignatius a couple of church fathers ago. Anything through number 4? Number 5, this is one quotation from the epistle. Stand fast, therefore, in this conduct and follow the example of the Lord, firm and unchangeable in faith, lovers of the brotherhood, loving each other, united in truth, helping each other with the mildness of the Lord, despising no man. I have no problem with that quote. It sounds like something that honestly could have been written by Paul. And in particular, I appreciate that united in truth. Okay, because unity, so often in our religious community, unity is simply because we decide to be united. But the New Testament teaching on unity is that you can only be united if you're first in truth. That's the only way you can be united together, is if you first united in truth. And so that's important to emphasize. And so I have no problem with that quote from that letter. Anything through number 5? Yes, sir.
Scriptures, we believe.
Yeah.
So were these fellows such as this, or any list, were they just taking it on themselves to try to, I need to encourage people over Philippi or wherever?
So especially in those first 100 years after the apostles, especially Peter and Paul and the rest of them had died, those who especially may have been taught by the apostle John or trained, if you will, by John, a lot of people relied on them to continue to assist them. And so that's where these individuals, they didn't necessarily seek that position, even though there are some people who try to say, but they were the elder or the bishop of so-and-so. They were individuals because they were the last remaining ones who had any connection to the apostles. People tend to rely on them more so than anybody else. Of course, and even in some of these letters, some of the quotations we don't have, these individuals, these men, still referred to the Scriptures. They said, listen, go back and read what Paul said to so-and-so or whatever. And so this emphasis that they're placing on this of the Scriptures was important. But the reason why we're talking about all of this is because we want to establish the mindset of the Christians in the 150 to 200 AD time frame. Because when we get to 200, we're going to understand at least what people are saying or are attributing to these church fathers, to understand their influence and to realize why people would be tempted to take their name and write something of their own, claim it was written by Polycarp, and say this is the way things need to be. Because this is ultimately the turning point ultimately that ends up spawning every denomination takes place in and around 200 AD. Okay, and so this is kind of setting the stage to understand, here's what we do know that, or at least is attributed that is good about these men, and then here's what perhaps men like Irenaeus and later Eusebius would take these men, take their words and claim they said, which, and oftentimes, especially the way the scholars kind of look at it now, they contradict earlier sayings of these men that are attributed to them. And to see how man has deliberately changed not just the words of the gospel, but then the words of the people who came after the gospel because of their influence to change and twist the scriptures to create a whole 2,000 years worth of denominations. So that's why we're going through some of this. I apologize if it's dry, if it's boring, and as soon as we're done with Polycarp and Papias, that'll be it for this kind of this stuff. After that, like I said, we'll be talking about the fragments, and then we'll be talking about the different denominations that came after that. But I feel like it's important to kind of set this, to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are hearing not only perhaps real Polycarp and real Ignatius, but then hearing these letters that are being written that are very different than what the scriptures taught, and to understand what it was they supposedly stood for that ultimately caused a lot of people to fall away from the faith later. Any thoughts on that?
Where did this history stuff come from?
Some of this came from Encyclopedia of the History of the Church. Some of it came from Fox's Book of Martyrs. Some of it came from Wikipedia. Some of it came from, there's another one. I forget what the other one was. I'll have a whole list of bibliography in the notes when I get them printed out.
So did you compile all of this yourself?
Yes, ma'am. I mean, I didn't type it all out. I just, copied and pasted different sources that fit with what, we're talking about, that seemed applicable. So, anything else about that? Okay. Number 6. One of the letter's more important features is its use and citation of other early Christian writings, many of which later came to be part of the New Testament. Some of the others would have been men like Clement and Ignatius and so forth, some of these other writings that are being mentioned. But most of what he quoted came directly from the New Testament, and that's very important. All right, and that's it for Polycarp. Any thoughts or questions through number 6? All right, so let's talk about our final one, which is Papias. All right. So, talking about Papias of Hierapolis. Papias was a Greek apostolic, quote, apostolic father, which is to say he had connection to John. He was a bishop of Hierapolis, an elder of Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey, an author who lived between 60 and 163 AD. He was one of the longer-lived of our church fathers, if you will. It was Papias who wrote the exposition of the sayings of the Lord in 5 books. This work, which is lost apart from brief excerpts in the works of Irenaeus of Lyons and Eusebius of Caesarea, recognize those two, is an important early source on Christian oral tradition and especially on the origins of the somebody say that word for me. Canonical, right? Canonical Gospels, which is to say the writings of the New Testament, because they're considered the writings of people who were either inspired or who were apostles. That's why they're canon. Okay, so we know he wrote a series of books, this exposition of the sayings of the Lord, but what's really interesting about this is some of those sayings aren't recorded anywhere. That's not to say that they may not be accurate. I mean, we know that John says there were many other things that Jesus did and said, but these things are written. But since Irenaeus, the only source for this is Irenaeus, who lived about 100 or about 80 years after he wrote these things, and then Eusebius, who wrote in 300 about these things, And both of these are suspect in their reporting because we know Irenaeus didn't believe the truth. There were things about the truth, the 1,000-year reign and so forth. We talked about that. Eusebius was very clearly already pulled into the Catholic Church sort of thinking and hierarchy of thought process. In fact, many of the things he wrote about these men go back to support the formation of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. So since we don't have anything directly written by him, it's hard to say if what they record about it is accurate. And notice that this source says it's an important early source on Christian oral tradition. Well, okay. But coming from those men, I mean, they could have said, hey, he said this, and used it to make their own ideas about things. Anything through number 1? Number 2, very little is known of Papias apart from what can be inferred from his own writings. And again, inferred from his own writings of what we have, and the quotations of what we have. He is described as an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp, by Polycarp's disciple Irenaeus. Eusebius adds that Papias was bishop of Hierapolis. Notice that. Eusebius adds this. In fact, a lot of these men who are called bishops, the bishop of this, or the elder of this, a lot of that's coming from Eusebius, because that's the world in which he lived, was that this encroaching thought process of the Catholic Church. So he may have been an elder of Hierapolis, but he wasn't the bishop of Hierapolis, around the time of Ignatius of Antioch. In this office, Papias was presumably succeeded by Ebercius of Hierapolis, and he's just another in a line of what's listed in terms of Christians who held the office of elder or bishop in these different places. The name Papias was very common in the region, suggesting that he was probably a native of the area. Anything for number 2? Yes, ma'am.
Well, maybe it's number 3. Let's do number 3.
All right, number 3. Eusebius refers to Papias only in his 3rd book, and thus seems to date him before the opening of his 4th book in 109. Papias himself knows several New Testament books whose dates are themselves controversial. He talks about dates like the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Revelation. Some people take an early date. I think there's clear evidence to say that it was written in the mid to late 90s AD. That's some of what he's talking about. Whose dates are themselves controversial, and was informed by John the Evangelist, daughters of Philip, and many elders who had themselves heard the apostles. He is also called a companion of the long-lived Polycarp. For all these reasons, Papias is thought to have written around the turn of the 2nd century, somewhere between 90 and 100 AD, when he's writing some of this stuff.
So my question is this. If I read the 1st or 2nd book correctly, how do they know what books they're in? Because it says there's only pieces of those 4 books he wrote.
Right. Well, and even at that, there's only the excerpts that were recorded by Irenaeus and by Eusebius. So, but they specifically say Papias in his books, in one of his 5 books on this and that, like Eusebius, for instance, where we say that? Yeah, right here. No. Yeah, number 3. And refers to Papias only in his 3rd book. So Eusebius quotes only this 3rd book of 5 that Papias wrote, and dates that writing of that 3rd book around 109 AD. So, yes, ma'am.
So, is there, okay, like, I know with manuscripts in the Septuagint, there's multiple copies that all agree, and there's certain ways you can tell the authenticity and all that kind of stuff. Is there only one set of these books, or there's lots of sets with different pieces?
There's no sets.
There's none.
All we have are excerpts from Irenaeus and Eusebius, supposedly.
So there's no...
Now there are references to the fact that Papias had written these by other writings of the time.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual words of that,
So there's no way to really validate it?
there's no way to validate it.
Yeah.
There's no way to validate it.
With a manuscript and those kinds of things,
We
there's
could-
hundreds
right.
sometimes of pieces of those that all agree.
Right. But do you see how someone like Irenaeus could easily say, yeah, Papias wrote, everybody knew about Papias' writings, presumably, And, we don't really have a lot of those copies left, but here's one of the things he said. And he could have put in anything he wanted that Papias supposedly said that Jesus said. Okay? And people would have taken Irenaeus' word for it, because Irenaeus himself was friends with Polycarp. He was friends with Papias. So Irenaeus, some of the damage that just one man, and this is part of what I'm wanting to point out too, is that specifically with Irenaeus and Eusebius, okay, and they weren't the only ones by far, but these are the two that we have the most writings concerning these early Christians. These two men by themselves were the majority of the sources for what ultimately became the Catholic Church. And Eusebius the Catholic Church was already in its formation by that point. But Irenaeus especially, and some of these others, because they, and again, I'm not necessarily excluding that the possibility that some of these men may not have taught the truth, but what we do know for sure, the things that are directly attributed, some of which we don't have, but the things that we do have, everything seems to be fine. There's nothing I specifically disagree with in what we know were written by these men specifically. But it's what's taken later, or said about them, or was quoted about them, or they said that it said that they wrote this, that ultimately causes things to contradict itself and to contradict the gospel. Lisa.
Well, I was just going to say, we've all been misquoted before.
Oh, yeah.
Just,
Taken out of context.
Or they don't read everything you wrote down if you're leaving a written message.
Right.
But, we have the assurances from God that not one dot or one tittle will change, where we don't have those assurances with this. So
Exactly.
we have to take it for what it is, a work of man.
Yep.
And you can see where, it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, that Martin Luther never wanted a church named after him.
No, he didn't.
And he was but what happened? Men went their own way.
Yep.
And named a church after him.
Yep.
So, even though he was pretty staunch about it,
Yeah.
men just took it and went. So it'd be pretty easy to misquote these people when they're
Oh.
no longer around and their works are no longer
Well,
around.
and here at the end of our notes on Papias, one of the things that some of the modern scholars say is that there is thought process that many of the things that Papias did right were taken out of context by Irenaeus and Eusebius, and they interpreted them wrong as a result. But it's interesting how certain personas kind of define some of these individuals as a result. Like some of these sources, they say, this is what Papias said, without even stopping to say, this is what Papias supposedly said because of the recordings of Eusebius, even though Eusebius was 200 years after the fact. It's misleading. But you see, it goes to show that even 2,000 years later, or 1,800 years later, even now, people still take this as truth. When in the New Testament, like in Irenaeus' time, when Irenaeus was writing some of the things he wrote about these individuals, and I know there were some Christians who said, hey, this is not what the Scriptures taught. So if Papias actually said that, Papias was wrong. Or Polycarp was wrong. Or Ignatius was wrong. I know there were Christians who did that. But the influence that they had, and that they didn't want, but because of their situation, because the apostles had recently died, because of people who were confused and were easily turned away, this is kind of the situation that resulted. Yes, ma'am.
And this is why we have to be ever vigilant to know what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Because men today because there's so many, they're not translations, they're
Interpretations, yeah.
interpretations of the gospel. And sometimes, as we know, changing one word changes the meaning.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's why we, as individuals, have to be cognizant of what's being preached from the pulpit, or the class, or our neighbor, and even what we say, to be sure that it's in line with the gospel.
Right.
Because we could easily lead someone astray if we're not careful.
Right.
Or be led astray by someone that we think, oh, he's got it together, and,
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how often the scholarly pursuits, scholarly but not religious, intertwine with those who are religious. Because there are those who pursue the study of this stuff from a scholarly perspective, not from a religious or spiritual perspective at all, and they may even be atheists, but from a scholarly, ancient writing type of perspective. So in their mind, when a lot of this is being written, it's the evolution of Christianity. It has nothing to do with divine inspiration, has nothing to do with divine guidance of God. It has everything to do with just simple evolution of an idea of Christianity, and this is how things changed. So who cares if Papias actually said it or not? Eusebius says he did, so we're just going to trust Eusebius because we have no horse in the race. We don't really have any issue here. But then that gets taken by those on the spiritual side of things as truth. Well, obviously, Eusebius knew what Papias said. Papias said this. Papias was taught by John, so obviously some of the stuff we know in the gospel isn't true. And that's what happens. Anything else for number 3? Number 4, we don't have a number 4. Writings. Let's see. And so because we don't have a lot about Papias, this one's not as long. I don't think we'll get to finish it, but we will finish it next class. So we'll be done with this next class. Number 1 about the writings. The work of Papias is dated by most modern scholars to about AD 95 to 120. Despite indications that the work of Papias was still extant, still existing in the late Middle Ages, the full text is now lost. When they say the full text is still in existence in the Middle Ages, they're talking about specifically the references, or perhaps the greater references from Irenaeus and Eusebius, as well as possible copies that existed. They're not talking about the literal copies of what he wrote. These would have been copies made by Irenaeus, supposedly, or by anybody who really wanted to put their name to it. So that's part of the problem that is being involved in this. Appear in a number of other writings, some of which cite a book number. This is a different source than the other one. He's specifically referencing Irenaeus and Eusebius. Number 2, Papias describes the way of gathering information in his preface. I shall not hesitate also to put into ordered form for you, along with the interpretations, everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders, and noted down carefully, for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I took no pleasure in those who told many different stories, but only in those who taught the truth. Nor did I take pleasure in those who reported their memory of someone else's commandments, but only in those who reported their memory of the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Aristian, and we'll talk about Aristian in a minute, and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. When he says the books, he's not saying that I don't trust the Gospels or the New Testament writings that they had. Remember, a lot of this wasn't all compiled yet. What he's talking about were the things that were written outside of these others. Okay, people that were disciples of Jesus who wrote books. You know, we talk about the epistle of Barnabas and stuff like that has already been disproven and so forth. That type of thing. He doesn't trust things outside or beyond first-hand accounts, is what he's emphasizing there. And I have nothing wrong with that first introduction. But can you imagine if, let's say, Irenaeus did have some copies of these or fragments of what he wrote, and he starts off with that preface, but then he starts inserting his own thoughts. This is the truth, and just puts it in his name. And it's very difficult to associate or to determine exactly what was said by Papias, and that's part of the problem. Anything through number 2? Number 3, Papias then inquired of travelers passing through Hierapolis what the surviving disciples of Jesus and the elders, those who had personally known the 12 apostles, were saying. One of these disciples was Aristian, we talked about him just a second ago, probably a bishop of nearby Smyrna, and another was John the Elder, usually identified, despite Eusebius' protest, with John the Evangelist, residing in nearby Ephesus, of whom Papias was a hearer. Papias frequently cited both. From the daughters of Philip, who settled in Hierapolis, Papias learned still other traditions, again, supposedly. Eusebius concludes from the writings of Papias that he was a Chiliast. Ever heard of a Chiliast or Chiliast? I don't know exactly how that's pronounced. Chiliast. understanding the millennium as a literal period in which Christ will reign on the earth, and chastises Papias for his literal interpretation of figurative passages, writing that Papias appears to have been of very limited understanding and felt that his misunderstanding misled Irenaeus and others. So note, Eusebius condemns what Papias claims to say, that Papias believed in a millennium and that this convinced Irenaeus. But isn't it interesting that it could also have been the fact that when Irenaeus got a hold of the things that Papias wrote or heard about them, that Papias simply could have, because he already believed in a millennium, kind of wrote this stuff in there to vindicate himself. Eusebius is writing this 200 years after the fact. He doesn't know. So whether Papias really was a premillennialist or not, I tend to think not. I tend not to trust Irenaeus or Eusebius for that matter. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up here with number 5 next Wednesday. Yes, next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.